Hey, it's Will from EDM Tips. So in today's video, we are going to go into exactly what mastering is and why it's important, the equipment that you need to actually do a good master, how to check your music is actually ready for mastering, and of course the entire process, including adding harmonic excitement, reductive EQ, compression, sweetening EQ, the stereo field, and loudness too. We're also going to be answering the question, how loud should you master for Spotify? And I'm going to give you a secret little hack for getting your music sounding louder than everyone else's. So let's touch upon why mastering is so important, and there are a few reasons for that. I think 4 actually. So the first, that it polishes and makes your music sound better. This is like adding the icing to a cake. Everything has to be already in its place, but you just want to bring out that last bit of flavor, get everything nice and loud and sounding as good as your favorite artist, which brings me on to point number 2. You want it to be hitting the industry standards in terms of the frequency spread and the loudness predominantly. So if your music is uploaded to a streaming service, or you can download it as a WAV or an MP3, you want it to be standing up against similar music in your genre. Now the third reason is if you have an album or an EP, the chances are you want everything to sound like it's kind of coming from the same place, and that's when you will have mastering, just to make sure every track is finished off in the same way and it doesn't jar too much when you switch from one track to the next. And the final reason is if you're having your music released on a record label, for the same reason as point 3, those guys will want their music to have a certain sound to it and a certain frequency spread and loudness, which again is why mastering is so important. Now there is a 5th reason as well, but it's not really used so much nowadays, and that's mastering for vinyl. There are very specific mechanical limitations to having a record released on a vinyl record, but I'm not going to delve into that today because I want to focus on what most of you guys are producing, and that's music for electronic release. So let's hop into the DAW and I'm going to show you this mastering chain. So the first stage is our setup. How do we set up our DAW project, regardless of which DAW you're using, to be most effective for mastering? I also want to touch upon the headphones I'm using. I do all my mastering in my headphones. I'll probably get frowned upon for that and get some nasty comments, but this is just what works for me because I know these headphones really well. Now these are the Sennheiser HD 650s. But I've linked to a few other recommendations for mastering headphones below as well. Now, regardless of whether you're using headphones or monitors, if your room isn't set up really well for mastering, I recommend using Sound ID Reference, which is a piece of software which you can put on your computer, and it will attenuate whichever monitors or headphones you're using to create as flat a frequency response as possible. And that's really what we're after when we're mastering, because we want to know exactly what the true sound sounds like, because it's going to sound different on different systems. So starting off with it as close to a flat response as possible is really important. Okay, so I'm using Ableton today, but as I said, doesn't matter which DAW you're using. I've got a blank audio track and I'm just going to open up another one. Now one is going to be for our reference track, which is very important. We'll touch upon that very shortly as well. And then one is for our track as well. So we'll just call this track. Next thing we want to do is make sure that we have a mono switch on the master channel. Now this is something that I've devised because I don't have a audio interface that allows me to just switch to mono, but basically it's going to sum everything to mono with a flick of a switch, just a keyboard shortcut, and that's just going to make our ears have to work less hard to determine what's sounding good in terms of the frequency balance, because we're not going to be distracted by the stereo field. So that's the first thing I would do. Next, I'm going to put a couple of really important but free tools on each channel. I'm going to use a span, which is a spectrum analyzer. It's quite useful, you can resize it there. And I'm going to put a Ulian loudness meter, which measures the LUFS values, which you've probably already heard of somewhere else, but the LUFS value is how we measure the average loudness of the track. So now we have both of those on our reference track and both of those on our track. So let's bring in our track and let's bring in a reference track that's in the same style, that has kind of the sound that we're going for. So the track we're going to be mastering today is by me and my studio partner, the Visionaires, and it's called Plan 9. It's a remake of an old 808 State track. And the reference track I'm going to be using is 17 by MK. I'm not going to play that track because I don't want to get flagged for copyright, but you can see that it's much louder because it's already been mastered. Whereas our track is peaking at about -6, perhaps a bit quieter than that, so we've got plenty of headroom. Now, having your mix down peaking at about -6 as opposed to 0 dB is important when it comes to using analog modeled plugins, and we will be touching on those shortly, but we want our signal to be going into them at the optimum level. Now, if your mix down is peaking at 0, it doesn't matter. You can just bring down the wave until it's peaking at about -6. It's not an exact art, but that's a good rule of thumb. So once these are both in, we want to get them comparable in volume so it's easier to reference them. And that means I need to take down this reference track so it's a comparable average volume to our track. So the peak volume is, as you would expect, the loudest point that the peak hits in a track, but the average volume is the energy level over several seconds or more. And incidentally, that's what the LUFS measures. So a really quick lesson on loudness. Things sound louder to our ear if they are more prolonged. For instance, that might have a peak that's the same as me just going, ah, but me screaming is going to sound louder because it's the same volume prolonged for a long period of time, which is why you get these kind of sausage shapes when it comes to mastering music. Anyway, so let's get these average volumes matched about right. So with your track, I recommend going to the busiest point, which is usually the last chorus. So we're just going to loop that. And then let's see what we are hitting in terms of average volume, because we know we're peaking at about -6.5, -7. And this integrated LUFS value is about -19.3. I'm going to take that up a tiny bit. I want that to be hitting at about -18, because that's the sweet spot when it comes to the analog model plugins. So I'm just going to boost it up a little bit and let's have a look. Whoops. -18. That's pretty much fine. As I said, it's not an exact art, that's close enough. So now we need to get our reference track hitting the same. And to do that, all I'm going to do is put a gain plugin at the beginning of that chain. I'm going to bring it down until our average volume of that is hitting about -18 as well. And it's usually about -12 peak that you take it down. Excellent. So we can see that they're about -18.5 and ours is -18.5. So now we've got the average loudnesses matched, we can compare things a bit more closely. So what I'm going to do is open up this spectrum analyzer on the reference track and on our track. And we just want to make sure, or rather have a look, to see how we're looking in terms of frequency spread. So this is our track, and this is the reference track. Now it's important to have these windows the same size so the graph is the same scale. And if we look over here and see where the kick drum is hitting, or the bass, it's hitting about -42 decibels on the reference track. Now on ours, it's hitting about -45. So we can already see there's a bit of work to do in terms of frequency spread. Ours is quite high here. It's not quite high enough up here compared to the reference track, and it's not quite high enough in the low end. So just having those visual cues makes it much easier, because sometimes your ears get tired, sometimes you lose objectivity. So now we've got our track and our DAWs set up right, it's time to listen through to our mixdown and actually determine whether it's ready for mastering at all. I've actually created a free checklist as well that you can download below, which you can go through every time you finish a track to make sure it's ready for mastering. So what I recommend is listening through your track with completely fresh ears. Are you happy with how it sounds? Ideally, when a track hits that mastering stage, we should already like how it sounds. It should sound pretty much finished, we just need to increase the loudness. Are there any pops or hisses on the vocals? Is there any audible distortion or clipping that you don't like the sound of? What I do is also reduce the volume of my monitoring until it's really quiet, and then listen through. Can I hear the main elements? That's usually the kick, the main clap or snare, the bass, and then the main vocal or lead instrument. If I can hear all of those when the monitoring is really down low, that's a good sign. Then I turn the monitoring up louder. Are any of those too overbearing? Another question to ask yourself, when you're listening through your mixdown, do you find yourself turning up the volume in certain places, turning it down in other places because it gets either a bit too loud or quiet? You really want to just be able to leave the volume completely alone when you listen through and have everything be the correct relative loudness. For example, your verses are probably going to be a bit less intense than the choruses, and your break is going to be less intense than the verses. Now, if you struggle with balancing your mix, I'm linking to a video right there, which is going to show you the mistakes you're probably making and how to solve them. So you can watch that after this video. Okay, so assuming our mix is ready to be mastered, and the last thing to check is when you've attenuated your reference track, is the frequency spread kind of roughly in the right direction? We saw that it was with regards to my mixdown and our reference track, so we know that this is good enough to be mastered now. You can also use this tool Tonal Balance by Isotope, which is also going to give you a similar idea in terms of the frequency balance and whether your track is on the right path. So we can open it up on our track. It's got presets for different kind of music. So let's put EDM and then play our track. And these bands here are collated from many thousands of tracks in this genre. and these are the average frequency bands. Now we can see the white lines here are actually more or less in the middle of these bands. So we can again see that our track is along the right path as well as here. So this is a pretty useful tool as well. Although to be honest, I personally prefer span. It's just the way I work. So assuming our track is ready for mastering, the next thing we need to do is zoom in and just add a little volume fade at the very beginning and at the very end, just to make sure that we don't end up with any pops or clicks when our track goes through the compressors and other parts of the mastering chain. So I'm just going to do a tiny little fade here, barely audible. And our track starts on a transient as well. I probably shouldn't have done that, but I have, and that's what we're working with. And then go to the end of the track and just fade it out in the manner that you would like to hear it faded out, if there is a big fade out. I quite like that to go a bit longer actually. So we've just faded it out at the beginning and the end. So the next stage is the coloring phase. And this is optional, but I always recommend trying it because usually it's going to sound better. So once again, I'm going to loop the busiest part of the track, the final chorus. And then what I'm going to do is add my coloring plugins. Now these plugins need to come in before our reference plugins. And we always want to keep these referencing plugins at the end of the chain so we can actually reference all the changes we make as well. So the first thing I'm going to bring in is this fantastic tool called the Oxford Inflator. Now this is kind of a saturation / harmonic exciter. And I'm just going to feed in a little bit of it and it's going to bring some high-end energy to the track. So let's try that. But it's important to do an A/B test and gain match this because things tend to sound better when they're louder anyways. So we need to make sure that the peak volume is the same as it was before we applied this effect. So let's go to our track. Before we apply the inflator, about -6. See, now that's a bit louder, so we're going to take down the output. That's about right. So the peak level is the same, but it just sounds a bit louder and a bit fatter. And that's the beauty of the Oxford Inflator. Now, next plugin that I'm going to recommend you try is the Bark of Dog. This is, again, a free plugin. And this is just going to add some extra low end. So what I like to do is boost it up quite high and then use this Hertz control to find the sweet spot of the fundamental of the track. This is good if you find that your track always lacks a little bit of low end when compared to your reference tracks. If I push it up too hard, so I can hear about 44 Hertz is where there's some real low end power coming. Now I'm going to dial this right back and just tweak it in. Usually to 7 or 8 dB I find works quite well. It just warms up the low end beautifully. So this is off. And if we open the span, this is with the Bark of Dog off. You watch this area. It's just bringing it up a little bit, which is what we wanted in terms of comparing it to our reference track. Anyway, so these could be considered one element. This is the coloring section of our master chain. The next thing I want to do is reductive EQ or corrective EQ, because you might do some additive here as well. But this FabFilter Pro Q3 is a fantastic plugin, and you can click the link checking up now for my in-depth review of this plugin and why people love it so much. But what I'm going to do is take out, firstly, the low end underneath about 30 or 40 Hertz. And this is because most systems don't go below 30 or 40 Hertz. Yes, some big festival stacks will, but as I said, most systems don't. So by cutting out these larger low-end frequencies, you're actually giving yourself more headroom so your final track can actually be louder. So let's just take a curve up at about 30 Hertz. It should be inaudibly different. So you can't hear the difference. Next thing I like to do is take out the bass in the side channels underneath about 120 Hz. Now that's because bass frequencies can quite often cause phase cancellation if they're in stereo. So I find this just cleans up the mud in the low end usually. So I'm going to create another low cut, except I'm going to switch it to mid-side mode, or side mode rather. And I'm going to take out the low end underneath about 130. The other thing I'm going to do on the side channels, which I like to do, is just add a little bit of a high shelf just to boost the side channels. It makes it sound a bit wider. So that's my go-to move, but now what we want to do is check the frequency spread of our reference track again against our track, because we've made some EQ changes. We're probably going to want a couple more, so let's open them up side by side and see what's going on. Okay, I can see that we could do with a little bit more high end here. So I'll create a stereo rather than a side boost. And let's take up the central channel too. Bit crisper. So if we compare, sounding good. Okay, so that is the corrective EQ stage. Now let's go on to compression. Now there are a couple of types of compression that you can use when it comes to mastering. The most common would be a glue compressor or an SSL bus compressor, which is based on the SSL hardware desks. I find that the Ableton glue compressor is okay. You don't quite get as nice a sound as the Waves SSL comp, but it's a barely audible difference. So I'm just going to use the Ableton compressor in this instance. And what we're looking for is about 2 dB of gain reduction. Now remember, this is going to differ for each track that you master. You should try these things and then determine whether your track sounds better with them on or with them off. It is always worth trying because it might sound better. So for house music in particular, or for any electronic dance music, I like to set the attack to 30 milliseconds because that allows the kick to maintain its dynamic energy and pop through the mix a bit. I set the release to automatic and I leave the ratio on 4, and I'm looking for about 2 decibels of gain reduction, and that should just glue everything together nicely. Okay, 2.5. And then I'm going to boost the makeup gain by the amount that we've just reduced the gain. And I'll put the soft clip on, although there's no clipping, so it really doesn't make any difference in this instance. But let's try A/B test. So that's off. It's just gelling everything together, and now it's starting to sound like a mastered track. Now the other option when it comes to compression is multiband compression. Now this is a bit more complicated, and actually this is a great way to ruin your mix or your master if you don't know what you're doing. And the one I like to use is the Ozone 9 multiband compressor. I just like the interface. And what this allows you to do is compress each different frequency band of your track differently. I usually find that it's the bass where you need to do most of the compression work because the bass has got larger waveforms. So you need to make sure that's locked in and controlled. And you can do this by ear first. So again, I just look for a few dBs of gain reduction. Let's just look for a couple of dBs gain reduction there. And we want this blue to be going right back up to 0 each time. If the compressor isn't completely releasing, then it just means you're reducing the volume. So there's no point doing it, okay? And now we're going to boost that gain by the amount we are compressing it by. So this is a great way to get a lovely, thick, deep bass line. So now let's have a listen. Does it sound better or worse? It's a bit hard to tell, but when we do our frequency referencing, in a couple of minutes, we will be able to turn these things on and off and then determine whether it's an improvement or it's to its detriment. So let's put these compressors together as they are both part of the same stage, the compression stage. And now we're on to the sweetening EQ. And I call it the sweetening EQ because this is where we can just add a little bit of extra color if we want into our track. And I always recommend using an analog modeled EQ at this point because it imparts some extra harmonics, a little bit of saturation, it warms the sound up a bit. And the one I'm going to use today is by Black Rooster Audio, and it is a model of the famous Pultec EQ. So before we do any moves on this, let's open up our reference track frequency spread. Let's open up our track frequency spread after the work we've done so far and make sure that they are on the right path. So theirs is minus 42 on the bass, ours is minus 42 on the bass. Ours might be a little bit high on the high end, so I might attenuate the high end here using this sweetening synth. That's about 10k. So if we change this to 10k, we can just tone it down a tiny bit. Now there's the Pultec EQ trick, low end EQ trick, so we can boost it. So it's a bit high. You can see it's a bit high, but then we can attenuate it as well. And what that does is just warms up the low end a little bit because it's pushing it through the model of a circuitry. So this is going to be subtle, but see if you can hear the difference. So we're just warming up the entire sound basically. Now don't worry if you can't hear these differences yet, they do come with practice. Okay, so we are getting to the final part of the mastering chain, which is the loudness, and I've got plenty to say about the loudness, especially when it comes to Spotify. But before we do that, we want to make sure that our stereo width is handled and dialed in. This is the next part of the mastering chain. So what I'm going to do for this is use the Ozone imager. I'm going to pop that on. And we want to make sure that our stereo field is comparable or wider than our reference track. Now I say or wider because sometimes if it's an older track, they might not have had this tool then, and the stereo width can be a little bit less than you might want for a modern mix. So we've got our track on the right, the stereo field, and we've got their track on the left. So let's just have a look at this vector scope here and see how they compare. So we can see our track is actually wider already. So there's not really any work to do. However, I'm going to choose to do some. I'm going to put a band in at about 120 because this is a multi-band stereo imager. Fantastic tool this. And then I'm going to spread some of these other bands a bit wider whilst locking in that lower band to be a bit more mono so we don't run into stereo phase cancellation issues. But to be honest, this is absolutely fine. I can leave that alone. So let's see if we can push these top ones. That sounds a bit much. So not much stereo work to be done there, but let's just do an A/B test and determine whether ours sounds better or worse. And we'll listen to it in mono as well, using my mono switch. Don't forget about that on the master channel. So let's have a listen. So that's on, and this is off. Just opens up that mix. And now let's test in mono. Yeah, this tool is fantastic because it doesn't really create a harsh effect, which can create some strange, slightly phasing sound. So this is really good for stereo width. And then we are on to the final stage of mastering, which is of course the loudness. And how loud should you actually master your music? Well, you should master it to 2 levels. Why 2 levels? Well, One is for the maximum loudness for playing out on CD or download from a site like Beatport, and the second loudness setting should be for the streaming platforms such as Spotify, because what they will do is attenuate tracks that are mastered too loud, and they will bring up tracks that are mastered too quiet. And that's to give a nice even loudness when people are listening to multiple tracks on Spotify. So let's dig into the loudness stage and how to get that. Well, the tool that we're going to use is of course a limiter, which many of you will already know. Now the one I like to use is the FabFilter Pro L2. So we're going to pop one there on ours. And the first stage I would do is try and get this to match our reference track. Now remember, our reference track is a download, so this is a maximum volume. This isn't streaming volume, this is the maximum loudness volume. So this is a good place to start because it's easier to make your track quieter than to push it louder. So our reference track is hitting. If we take off this attenuation, I'm just going to turn down the monitoring so I don't deafen myself. We should now be hitting at our maximum loudness for our reference track. So it's about minus 7.5 integrated LUFS, which is the average volume. And then wow, we've got a true peak max of 3.7. Okay, that's pretty loud. So what we're going to do is now go to our track. We've got our mastering compressor here, our mastering limiter, sorry. It's a type of compressor, by the way. And we want this to be getting our track to about minus 7.5 on the loudness as well. So let's open up our loudness meter on our track and just bring up the input gain on our limiter. Too loud. I usually find that you don't want to have more than about 6 or 7 gain reduction. Okay. So if we turn off true peak limiting, our true peak max can actually get pushed up a bit. So now we've got our maximum loudness that I would export for use on Beatport or any other sharing for DJs so they can play it out at clubs. But now we need to touch upon Spotify because let's be honest, most of us are going to be releasing our music on Spotify. Now, minus 14 LUFS is what Spotify says on its website for mastering and a true peak value of no more than minus 2. So once I've exported my maximum loudness master, this is how I would create a version for Spotify. I'm going to open up the loudness meter, and remember we want to get this to about minus 14 LUFS and about minus 2 maximum on that true peak max. So we can take down the input gain on our limiter. And that's already taking it down, but it's a bit too far. Now I've actually found for Spotify that mastering to about minus 12 or minus 10 tends to be fine. And you can check this using a website called loudnesspenalty.com, and I'm linking to that below this video. And you can just drag and upload your track and see how much it's going to be penalized. So we can see ours is hitting minus 12 on the LUFS. So I'm going to take it down a bit until we are hitting minus 14. Sounds about right. So I'm just going to export this really quickly. Let's drag our loop onto the website and we can see here that we are going to be penalized very, very slightly. It's going to turn our volume down by 0.2 on Spotify, which is to say it's not really going to penalize it at all and it's going to sound great. Now, I promised I'm going to show you a little hack for Spotify. And I actually got this from Bassclef, so props to you Bassclef. Spotify measures the LUFS value over the entire length of the track. So if it's an average volume, as you can imagine, if your track is loud all the way throughout, the average volume of minus 14 is most likely also going to be the average volume of your final chorus or drop, as we've just looked at in our example. But some of the older music from the 70s or the 80s, because it's more dynamic and has a lower average volume in general, Spotify will actually bring that up in volume. So the final chorus in one of these older tracks, because the earlier parts of the song are really quiet, the average volume overall has been logged as more quiet. So Spotify is going to bring the whole thing up in volume, which means those final choruses, the really epic ones, are actually louder than minus 14 LUFS. So the way that you could take advantage of this little hack is to have more breaks in your track, so there are more quiet parts, which means that overall the average volume is going to be lower, which means when your final drop hits, it's going to be massive. Now this is more of a theoretical hack. I don't recommend that you start building your tracks specifically on how loud you can get them, but do bear in mind dynamic range, because the more dynamic range you have, Spotify actually benefits you. So if you've got a break, perhaps take it really down in volume and energy, and then have your drop hitting hard. And any place that you can add some dynamic variation is going to be better for your listener, and Spotify is going to reward you by playing the track louder. Now, something else we need to touch upon regarding Spotify that's really important is that regardless of your average volume, aka your LUFS value, Spotify won't raise the volume of your track past a true peak of minus 1 decibel. So what does that mean? It means that if your track has an average volume of minus 18 LUFS, for example, but a true peak value of minus 3, then the most it can be raised by Spotify will be 2 decibels to minus 1 decibel true peak from minus 3. But that means your minus 18 LUFS is only going up to minus 16 LUFS average, which means you're missing out on those 2 decibels of extra loudness. So getting that balance between average volume and true peak volume is important to get the most from your Spotify master. Now, I mentioned I was going to help you with having your mix or your master translate well across multiple systems. Now, the way I've always done it, especially before I was as good as I am now at mastering, I would have to master a track, play it on multiple systems, take it in the car, play it on my iPod, play it on my hi-fi system in the house, as well as my monitors and my headphones. I used to play it on the laptop speakers as well. And then when I would listen to my track against my reference track on that system, I would make notes about what needed changing. Perhaps I could hear the bass on my reference track, but on my laptop speakers I couldn't hear my bass. I'd have to go into the mix down and add some more upper harmonics on the bass line. Now, that's a bit of a pain, but it is still the best way to do it, unless you've got a great studio with perhaps 2 or 3 sets of monitors that you can quickly switch between and check your master across multiple systems. However, there is a plugin available now called Mix Checker, which allows you to emulate playing your track on different systems. So you can check it out below, but having your final track translate well across multiple systems is absolutely essential, because someone could be listening to it on AirPods, they could be listening to it from their phone speaker, or they could be listening to it in a massive nightclub. So please don't cut corners and miss that part of the mastering process. Now I want to touch upon the biggest mistake that producers make when it comes to mastering, and it's this. Most producers, especially if they're in the beginning or intermediate stage, think that the mastering is going to fix their song and make it sound good. Now, whilst there is some truth to that, and that is that a really good mastering engineer will of course make your mix sound better, it will never and can never sound as good as it would if the entire composition and mix down was done really well in the first place. What we're aiming for before we go into the mastering stage as producers is for the track to sound as good as we already want it. So it should just be a case of increasing the loudness. That's really the target when we're going through the composition and the mix down. Now, I know that for some of you that might be a bit of a surprise and you think that mastering will actually fix it, but if you think about this analogy, if you gave a pretty standard cake to a world-renowned chef and asked him to ice it really beautifully, yes, it's going to look better, but it's still not going to taste very good. So we need everything from the ground up to be really good for the best possible master. Now, with that in mind, I've created a video for you there which is going to show you how to get a really loud mix and therefore a louder master, because a lot of that perceived loudness that we've already touched upon actually comes way before the mastering stage. But before you check it out, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll catch you over there.